don't have the PowerPoint on the live stream, but I've got it up here. But we're gonna look at basically the first half of Joshua chapter 2, and that's Joshua chapter 2 verses 1 through 11. So, what are some key things to keep in mind in this chapter? We know that one of the things that comes out of this chapter is obviously the story of Rahab, where she was prior to the Israelites entering into the promised land. And obviously what comes out of this account is a reminder of the theme that God can use anyone for his purposes, as we know that Rahab not only plays a role in what happens here, but also later on down the line as well in Israel's history. Of course, being connected to I believe in the lineage of the birth of Christ. That's important to keep in mind. Obviously the question for us is, how does that impact how we view others? I know a lot of people are of the persuasion that there are some people that they will never associate with in life, that they will never talk to in life. And that's a question that comes up here. I know we know of people that won't associate with others because of what they do, or won't talk to others because of what they do or what their background is. But this is a reminder again about how God is concerned about the salvation of everybody, as evident by what happens with Rahab, and as evident by the fact of where she starts out in her profession and then where she ends up. We certainly know that this is the theme that is often referred to in the New Testament when it comes to Jesus and the disputes that he had with his Pharisees about, the Pharisees wouldn't associate with a group of people. Jesus was more than willing to do that simply because he knew that they needed the gospel, just like the Pharisees did. And so that's something we need to think about. Rahab is somebody who comes from a background that a lot of people today find a background that of ill repute, a background that most people wouldn't want to talk to somebody that was in that profession. But the point is that God saw to it, obviously based on her own decisions, but also God saw to it that she had the opportunity to essentially be saved, or at least save her household from the destruction that comes later in the book of Joshua. The other thing is that life sometimes can have a way of reminding us of our need to follow after the Lord. And sometimes that looks differently for everybody. Obviously, Rahab's life would indicate to you that at no point in time would she ever, based on her profession, ever see the need to follow after the Lord. Yet, by the time that we get through at the end of that first section, we see that that's exactly what has happened. So those are two things to keep in mind. We're going to try to come back to those as we move forward in our Bible class this morning. So the first thing that we want to note is in verses 1 and 2 that there are two spies who were sent to Jericho. So we're going to begin in our reading, and Dad, I'm going to get you to read for us this morning, just because of I've got an awards day that I have to present at 2 o'clock today, so this is not going to be the last time I have to speak today. So, Dad, if you don't mind, could you read for us Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 and 2?
Then Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men to spy secretly from the acacia grove, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and came into the house of a harlot whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And bestowed the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, men from the sons of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land."
So Joshua chapter 2 begins immediately after the context of the people of God Joshua being told, and then Joshua reiterating to the tribes that they're about to enter into the promised land, that they are to take 3 days to get provisions. And we saw last week, everybody is unified in that mission. Even the tribes that have already acquired their land, the men of those tribes are satisfied with what Joshua has said, and they're willing to participate in this conquest moving forward. We're told in chapter 2 that where the Israelites are at this point is at a place called Shittim, or as what Brother Wayne read from, I guess, what the New American Standard Version, what's the other way that word or that term is translated? Yeah, the acacia grove. The location that's talked about there in verse 1, Shittim, is not necessarily a city as much as it is kind of an identification marker. That word, of course, depending on your translation, that word means an acacia grove or acacia trees, which is a particular type of tree that basically grows in a desert climate. More than likely, the context is that the Israelites are somewhere in this vicinity, just to the northeast of the Dead Sea, not too far away from much earlier in time, perhaps where the location of Sodom and Gomorrah were at. But that's where they're at this point. Acacias are a type of tree that grows out in the desert. This is a picture of an acacia tree. They're still very prevalent in the parts of the Middle East that are primarily desert. It's a tree that doesn't require a lot of water to be able to grow. Naturally, it's not a very tall tree, but it is very important in Israel's history. After all, the acacia tree, the Israelites would use acacia wood to make what items? Ark of the Covenant, the table of showbread, and the tabernacle. Those were all different items where the Israelites were required to use what was called either shittim wood or acacia wood. And those trees were very important. In other words, they're very important in the history of Israel for that reason. It's also kind of the final marker from where the people are going to leave to enter into the land of Canaan. But the place it's talked about there is not so much a city as it is a specific region east of the Jordan River where you have all of these desert trees, which have at this point been very important in Israel's history because of the ark, the table of showbread, and the creation of the tabernacle. And that's where they're leaving from. Again, here's a picture of different types of wood that have been cut out, different types of wood that have come from shittim trees. Some are darker colored, some are a little bit lighter colored. But again, if you're thinking about what did the Ark of the Covenant look like, what did the table of showbread look like, what did the tabernacle look like, it would have looked like some combination of this. At least the wood in those buildings would have looked some similar to this, is the point. So those trees are very important in Israel's history. Now they're important because this is the final step where they are leaving the territory east of the Jordan to go into the land of Canaan. And so we're told that they are sent to view the land. And as it says, especially Jericho. Now, in our minds, naturally, there should be a connection here, perhaps, to what Joshua had done, at this point, decades ago, when he and Caleb and the other men were told to go and spy out the land of Canaan, to now where Joshua is telling two men to go and do exactly the same thing, basically, right? To get a report of the land. And as we're going to note, the mindset of the people of the land. What we notice here, though, is that when we compare Numbers 13 with Joshua chapter 2, it's kind of an interesting comparison. In Numbers 13, Moses sent a relatively large group of people, 12 men, one from each tribe, to go spy out the land. And that, as a consequence, meant that knowledge of that mission was pretty widespread. At least it was widespread within the tribes because they had to figure out who they were going to send as part of that mission. But notice here, how does Joshua conduct this mission? That was different than how Moses did it. Secretly, right? And I put up here, perhaps the people have learned, maybe from Joshua's perspective, he recognized that because the first time when he was sent, that since the mission was so well known, you had that large backlash from the people who did not believe that they could enter in the land, whereas Joshua is of obviously the persuasion that, we're going to conquer the land. And so Joshua is not sending these spies as a way of determining, is this idea of going into Canaan a good thing, more so as it is him just getting feedback about the people of the land. Keep in mind that Joshua himself is a military general. He served in that capacity under Moses. And so that becomes important here because Joshua, as a military general, understands the importance of getting a layout of the land and the people and an estimate of their numbers. Now, obviously, Joshua trusts God to be able to, go and help them conquer the land, as we know what will happen with Jericho. But obviously, this is also important. The sending out of these two spies is also important because it's going to give the opportunity for Rahab to do the right thing, as we will see in a minute. And obviously, perhaps the people have learned from the context of, again, these are people who are willing to go into Canaan versus their ancestors who, because of their unbelief, led to the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. Jericho itself, this is a supposed model or recreation of what Jericho may have looked like at the time. From what we understand, it would have been the most fortified city immediately to the west of the Jordan River. Any attempt to conquer Canaan, at least, would mean that they would have to go through Jericho. They had to eliminate Jericho first before they could move any further inland. Jericho itself, well fortified city. I know these are some of the ruins supposedly of ancient Jericho. Jericho itself, while it was out in a desert area, had a lot of underground springs which provided water to the city. That's why the city itself was able to develop in the desert. Obviously, a very important target for Joshua moving forward. They had to eliminate Jericho before they could get to any other, before they could get anywhere else in Canaan. That's the first step. So Joshua wants, as it says, verse 1, wants a very thorough report about the city of Jericho in terms of moving forward. And so we notice here that the importance of this mission is more so about gauging the city's morale. When they went the first time into Canaan, the reports back were simply about how big the people were, right? Their physical selves and their defenses and things like that. Whereas with this mission, what becomes important, as Rahab is going to indicate to us, is what do these people think about the Israelites being on the verge of entering into Canaan? And that, of course, is what's going to give confidence based on what Rahab will acknowledge in verses 8 through 11. And so that's why this mission is going to be successful, is also because here Joshua's not worried about can we overcome their physical defenses as much as it is what do the people think about the Israelites. And that's going to be motivation, as we'll see, as they move forward. We notice that the king is obviously concerned about all of this. We're told in verse 1 that before the king is involved, they go to Rahab, who is, of course, a prostitute, as it says in verse 1. We know that in the Old Testament, and this is reaffirmed at times in the New Testament, the concept of prostitution was connected to idolatry, which is one of the reasons why the people of God, of course, were forbidden from both of these things. With Rahab's consideration, though, based on what she says in verses 8 through 11, that may not necessarily be the case, because we're going to see that Rahab, despite being a prostitute, at least recognizes that the God of Israel at least recognizes who he is and that he's very different than the gods that the Canaanites were worshiping. We know that prostitution supposedly is the oldest occupation that women have been involved in. If you go back into, our own country's history, especially during the Revolutionary War, this was actually one of the chief occupations that women had, because women typically did not work outside the home, but typically when women did, most often it was in this type of occupation. We keep in mind here that in the Old Testament, as well as in our modern time, a lot of times what drove women to this occupation was sometimes out of economic necessity, because again, there were not ways for women to make money outside of doing this. And we know that Rahab's going to have a family she has to take care of. And I'm not saying that to justify this practice, but one of the bigger reasons why women would engage in this type of activity was simply because of economic necessity, right? We don't read about a husband being involved in here. And so for some women who were desperate enough to provide for their family, we don't like to think about it. This is the route that a lot of them would take, because it was a way to obviously make money, even if it's not in a very, moral way of doing so. But the fact that she is in this position, as we're going to see, makes her more connected, or at least makes her more likely to respond to the Lord's plan for what's going to happen to Jericho. We know that for the spies, that they go to this house in part because this is an ideal place to go to. Again, a lot of men, especially men that are within the city, but also men outside the city, are going to obviously come through here. It's a way of gathering information. It's also going to be a location that for the spies, it would be easier to hide out in. Typically, these types of houses were located on the outside of the city and were more likely to not be directly observed by authorities. And as a consequence, this is an ideal place for them to hide, but also an ideal place for them to gather information, and not necessarily because they went there just to engage in this type of activity, right? We're not making that assumption, but if you're trying to get information, this is a very good place to go, because you're going to have a lot of men who would frequent through here of all different types of backgrounds is the point. And obviously Rahab's going to play a role in preserving the spies, as we'll see in a minute. But why go to Rahab's house? Simply for this reason: really good, really ideal place to get information. As it turns out, it's going to help save the lives of the spies, and also eventually help save Rahab's household. So we know that the king of Jericho is also aware of this situation. Keep in mind that the Israelites are only a few miles to the east of the Jordan River. We know from Rahab's own testimony in a minute that the people of Jericho know very well who the Israelites are, what they're about to do, and what they have done. The king himself has already probably scouted out the Israelites, and he knows that they're on the verge of crossing the Jordan River. And keep in mind, you're talking about millions of people that are about to all of a sudden be on the doorstep of Jericho. And that certainly causes some panic among the king, whereas verse 2 tells us that they are to that they are to go and find the men that have that are trying to search out the land. And so, for him, this is a very tense situation, because he knows what is very likely to happen. All right, and so they come. They're about to at least find, or at least they're looking for these spies. That's where we come to in verse 3 with a decision that Rahab now has to make. And this will show where her loyalty's at, but verses 3 through 7 now. Yeah, read.
And the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and she said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And it came about when it was time to go shut the gate at dark, that the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them in the stalks of flax which she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued them on the road to the Jordan to the fords, and as soon as those who were pursuing them had gone out, they shut the gate.
And this is part of the story that we're familiar with, right? These messengers from the king come to Rahab. They want to know where these men are. because obviously they're going to punish these men because they are spies. Rahab, of course, basically misleads these men, tells them, right, that they have left the city and that they need to go out and pursue these men. We know in reality that verses 6 and 7, she hides these men and essentially preserves their life. And her response to them we'll get to in a minute. But we notice here Rahab's response. And again, she leads the king's men astray. And the reasoning for that's going to come in verses 8 through 11. But, obviously this is a very significant moment. This is a very important decision that Rahab has to make. Because again, if she is caught, helping these men, right, she is complicit in helping them spy out and essentially being a traitor to her own people, right? That's what's at stake. But based on what she's going to say in verses 8 through 11, we also know that Rahab understands that something else is at stake, and that is obviously ignoring or rejecting the will of God for what's about to happen with Jericho. So she's got a she's got a decision to make here. Does she stay loyal to her people and face the wrath of God, or does she betray her people and risk the consequences of that in order to help out these men of God? That's a decision that she's having to make kind of right off the bat, or a decision that she's having to make very quickly. And obviously we know what she did. She decides to protect the men of God by leading the king's men astray. This theme is kind of prevalent in the Old Testament, or there are other occasions where you see some type of theme similar to this, where a woman of, I won't necessarily say ill repute, but a woman of very low status. We see this in the Old Testament at times where a woman of very low status is able to deceive men that are more powerful than her. Perhaps the first example that we see of this is Exodus 1, 15 through 21, where in that passage, who did the deceiving and who was deceived?
The Hebrew midwives deceived. Well, they said we couldn't get to the job was to kill the babies.
Right.
They were saying that, well, before we could get to the women, they'd already given birth. And so Pharaoh was the one who was deceived.
Right. Remember that Exodus chapter 1, Pharaoh gave the order. Pharaoh himself, also king, gave the order, right, to kill all the male Hebrew children. And the Hebrew, or the midwives in Exodus chapter 1 deceived Pharaoh, right? They did exactly the opposite of what he was telling them to do. That was important because it preserved the life of whom? It preserved the life of Moses. And so in that passage, like Rahab, those women had a choice about, do we deceive Pharaoh and not upset, do we deceive Pharaoh and not upset God in terms of eliminating his people, or, do we follow after Pharaoh and his command and then possibly incur the wrath of the God of Israel? Well, in that passage, obviously, they chose to preserve the life of those Hebrew male children, one of which, of course, would be Moses. In a similar fashion here, Rahab makes that same decision, and deception is clearly involved, but the end result is that both of these men are going to be preserved, and as we'll see, Rahab herself is also preserved in the process of it. We're told in verses 6 and 7, after the men go and pursue after them, that she had hid them on the roof. More than likely, the men perhaps believed what she said simply because that a lot of times these type of men who would go into the houses of prostitutes were also likely to leave at night, because again, sometimes men would not want it openly known that they were going to these houses, and so escaping by night rather than in the day was a very plausible scenario. But we know, of course, here Rahab hides these men on the roof. In the Middle East, a lot of times these houses, the roof was flat. In verse 6, it tells us that she hides the men with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. A lot of times these, what's referred to here, these stalks of flax, were items that were used to make linen, and they were put out on the roof in order to dry. And so these men are, again, hidden in something similar to this, but the point is that this was an ideal place to hide. It would not have been out of the ordinary for a woman to have this on her roof, because you could use this to make linen clothing and things of that nature. So in other words, when she gives the king's messengers this answer, this is a very plausible answer, right? We don't read about them wanting to search the house thoroughly. We don't read about them, breaking down the door and carrying out a very thorough search. The answer that she gave was more than normal for the king's messengers to hear. So they pursue after them, and she obviously goes up and finds the men that were hidden. Naturally, this is one of those debatable things that come up in the Bible a lot of times about Rahab's actions here, because clearly Rahab told the men a lie. And, there's a lot of questions that come up about here about, was Rahab right in lying in order to preserve the lives of the spies, in order to preserve, her own family later on? We know, of course, that in the New Testament, though, the importance that comes out of this situation is that the writers of the New Testament, who are indeed inspired by God, commend Rahab for what she did. So let's look at James chapter 2, verse 25, and then Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 31 to see what the New Testament writers said about Rahab. So James chapter 2 and verse 25.
And in the same way was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works, when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way.
All right, and then Hebrews 11 and verse 31.
I think the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace.
And so notice here in both of those passages, right, Rahab is commended. It may not necessarily specify that she's being commended for maybe lying, but the point is that Rahab had a decision to make about whether to do. We got to keep this situation in its context. Rahab understood that what was at stake was either doing what God wanted or not doing what God wanted, right? It was either following God's will or rejecting God's will. Now, based on what she said in verses 8 through 11, what did Rahab know about what God's will was in this situation? Yeah. In verses 8 through 11, Rahab indicates that she realizes that this land is about to belong to God's people and that God's about to help them conquer this land. And that's what's important to take away from this situation is Rahab recognizing what God's will was, even though she was not herself an Israelite, even though she herself came from a background in which very few people would ever think that a lady like this would ever do what God wanted. And yet, when she was given the opportunity to respond to God's will, she did exactly that. Yes, she hid the spies. Yes, she deceived the king's messengers. But the overall point is that she followed God's will. And in the context of Hebrews chapter 11, we know that the individuals listed in that chapter also made mistakes as well. They weren't commended for their mistakes, but Abraham, Moses, those men were commended for doing the will of God. That's what Rahab is commended for in James chapter 2 and Hebrews chapter 11, is the fact that when she understood that God was leading the people into the land of Canaan to give them that land, she wasn't going to stand in the way. She wasn't going to oppose what God wanted to do. And so that's the importance then of Rahab's response. Yes, we can, people get into arguments about whether she, the morality of exactly what she did. The prime focus is that she saw what God's will was, and that's what she was going to do. So then the message to the spies was very clear. Why would Rahab protect them? Because she and the people know exactly what's about to happen. She understands that God is about to, again, give this land to the people. So now verses 8 through 11 of Joshua 2.
Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, the Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And when we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath.
So notice here that Rahab and the people know what's about to happen. Again, the story of what happened with the Red Sea collapsing, the defeat of the Amorite kings of Og and Sihon, those are all past events that the people of Jericho were very well acquainted with. They certainly understood the power of the God of Israel helping his people win those conflicts. And that's why Rahab wants to protect them. She knows that if she doesn't protect them, she's going to incur the wrath of a God that is going to destroy Jericho. There's no doubt about that in her mind. She sees this as her opportunity to finally do the right thing. This goes back to that second point under those key points, that life has a way of causing us to realize to follow the will of the Lord. Again, Rahab engaged in an occupation that was very morally wrong. She engaged in an occupation that was not known for, that was known as a very, that had serious consequences in the Old Testament for engaging in. Yet, at this moment, Rahab, while her past life has not been very moral at all, this is her opportunity to now do the right thing. It's the reason why Jesus did not reject the publicans and sinners who came to eat with him, that came to hear him preach, because he recognized this was finally their opportunity to do the right thing. So she takes advantage, and as we're going to see, helps save her household. She had no other choice if she wanted to save her own life than to protect these spies. And as we're going to see next week, she's going to make a request of them that will only come because of her desire to do what God wanted her to do in this passage. With that being said, are there any final thoughts or comments before we end today?
Everybody else in Jericho had the same opportunity Rahab had, because
Right.
they heard the same thing she had. They chose to believe, and they chose to reject. People fault God for wiping all these folks out, but they had the same. Just
Right.
like today, one person hears the gospel and responds, another person hears the gospel, same message, and doesn't respond.
Right.
And it's not God's fault. He gives people the choice. It's the choice. Some made right choices, Rahab did, and some made the wrong choice. But everybody had opportunity.
Right.
To have faith.
Right. And we'll see that faith pay off next week when we pick up in verse 12. But thank you for your time and your attention this morning.